Hi, my name is Anna Woerman, and I am here to discuss my research question, which is in what ways does public displaying of student artwork influence their motivation and effort? So, the initial idea was I was interested in seeing what factors contribute to my students' motivation when they are showing their work in public. I was interested to see the increasing public display, if that had an influence, if something was just presented in our class as opposed to something that was just turned in, or something that was being displayed in public for a greater audience, possibly for our campus or even our community. So I knew my main variables were motivation and the amount of public display, but also was interested in seeing some themes that would develop, such as how they felt about showing their work in a more public space, and if their motivation was affected by having their work shown in that really higher, outside of the classroom, outside of the school um, possibility. So, like an art show or somewhere in our community. So I did a quantitative needs assessment. I asked 21 of my Digital Media Foundation students. These are first year students who 99% of them have no prior experience in digital media. So they're very beginner students. And so I gave them 5 questions using the 5-point Likert scale. And the questions were, what is your motivation to complete a project with detail and quality? If you were to just turn it in and only have the teacher grade it and see it, or turn it in and keep it for yourself and not receive a grade for it, present your project to your class only and receive a grade, or if your project were to be displayed publicly on campus for all of our high school to see and receive a grade for it, or if the project would be displayed publicly on campus for all of the high school to see and not receive a grade for it. So my quantitative needs assessment results were really interesting. Some of them were things that I kind of thought would develop, but there were still some really interesting results. So I have some graphs to show. So on the very top left, the grade variable comparison with less public display of work that the only teacher sees. So the green is their motivation level of when the teacher sees it and they receive a grade, as opposed to the red where the teacher only sees it and they don't receive a grade. So the green, they were more motivated to receive a grade, even though there's a very low public art thing happening here. The grade is a variable that they are much more motivated. Um, Beneath that, on the bottom left, the grade variable comparison within more public display of work. So if something was going to show on campus for all of the students to see. So the public display on campus and to receive a grade is green, versus publicly displayed on campus and not receive a grade. So they were all, of a high majority, were motivated because it was a public display of their work. They were more motivated to do a quality, good job. And if they, even though they weren't going to receive a grade, the motivation was high because it was going to be public. But the absolute most was if they were going to get a grade for it and it was public. That was that topped the charts there with the green. On the very top right, I have the public viewing variable comparison to the more private. So I'm comparing if they were just to present it in the classroom and receive a grade, which is in the red, or versus a public display on campus and receiving a grade. So these are kind of the opposites here. So the red, where they're presenting in the classroom and they're getting a grade, and the green, where they're presenting on campus and they're getting a grade. The grade is kind of a constant right there. They're getting a grade no matter what. But again, when in the green, when it was going to be a public display, they're more motivated overall. And on the bottom right, public viewing and grading variable comparison. So I'm comparing the most private without a grade versus the most public with the grade. And I'm comparing the most intrinsic and the most extrinsic, basically. So public on campus and receiving a grade is in green versus they turn it into the teacher only and they don't receive a grade in red. So the red you can see is kind of all kind of across the board. It's spread. The motivation is spread. So I'm thinking that the kids who are possibly just intrinsically motivated are going to do a good job no matter what. But it's a very interesting, I think the most biggest variation here because you're comparing the red, which is, hey, you turn it in to a teacher and you don't get a grade, so you really just have to be purely intrinsically motivated to do a good job, versus the green, which is you get to show this on campus for everyone to see and you're getting a grade for it. There is the highest motivation for that green. So really quickly, I wanted to compare and contrast not only the three levels of public display of work, which were teacher only, classroom, and campus, but I also knew that grades are a huge motivator to most students, and I wanted to see if the grade was or wasn't present, how would the student's motivation to create quality work be affected. So I could then have the data to compare and contrast grades versus no grades, private versus public, and cross compare also, like I did with grades, no grades, public, private, and so on. So my interpretation of the results is that overall the motivation to create quality work increased whenever there was a grade that would be received along with doing the project. Also, the majority of students would have higher motivation in their work if their work was more public, like a more public place than the typical classroom. And it was therefore not surprising that the greatest contrast was between the most intrinsic, which is where they turn it into the teacher only and they don't receive a grade, and the most extrinsic, which is on campus receiving a grade, situations where the majority of students were highly motivated when higher public display and grades were together. The qualitative needs assessment, I asked two open-ended questions to those same students. The questions were, how does having your work shown to others publicly make you feel? And if your current project were to be printed out and displayed in a public place, how would it affect your motivation for completing it with quality and detail as opposed to it just being presented in class? And I basically collected this data, which you can see, and I labeled it with neutral, positive, and so on. But overall, I was able to create percentages from the data, and 71.4% had an overall positive feeling regarding, if they had to show their work publicly. The second question, if your current project were to be printed out and displayed in a public place, how would it affect your motivation for completing it with quality and detail as opposed to it just being presented in class, how we regularly do? And so I compiled those answers into three categories and I labeled them: positively motivated, motivated but kind of stressed out to make a good piece, and not affected. And so the majority, 66.6%, felt overall motivated. Within that 66.6%, 52.4% were motivated, and 14.3% were motivated, but they were stressed, like they felt pressure to make a quality project. So that was an interesting thing that came up that I didn't even really think about. So the majority of the students felt positive and motivated when their work was displayed in a more public setting. And the additional variable came up that they were stressed, and anxiety kind of came up with they wanted to make their piece, turn out really well. So it was kind of a positive stress, if you will. So the needs assessment suggests that they're overall positively affected and motivated to do something for work that will be displayed publicly. So with my literature review, I found some interesting insights. I looked for a few things: motivation, intrinsic motivation especially, Also, different ways of how to assess students and hopefully help their self-efficacy. Um, so from one of the reviews, I thought one of probably my most interesting findings was from an article, journal article entry, pleasure derived from challenge and the effects of receiving grades. It showed that that students, especially art students, actually valued receiving a grade as their extrinsic motivation so much that they often chose less challenging problems to complete, so they were more sure of getting a good grade. And I thought that was very interesting, and that is, and I can see how that could happen. They don't want to challenge themselves too much or think too far outside the box because they're worried about the grade so much. So they're going to do kind of they're going to set the bar low so they know they're going to do something. They'll get a good grade, but they might not be achieving the best that they can do. Also, another article talked about different types of ways to foster intrinsic motivation, including divergent thinking, multisensory engagement, empathy, real 21st century kind of hands on learning skills, which I already do, but it was really interesting to see different approaches and how I can maybe focus on some of them a little more. And also another article explored the idea of there's three types of criteria to consider when you grade an assessment: product, process, and progress. So it was really interesting how it broke it down into different categories. My final research question, after I've not changed it, but I've made it a little more of an open-ended yet focused question. Before it was, I had all kinds of words about detail and quality, and it was kind of a yes or no answer. So again, the final one is: in what ways does public displaying of student artwork influence their motivation and effort? My action plan is I have three different parts. My motivation, I want to create a progression of more public presentations that will be given for students, and also some surprise presentations. And so they won't know if something's going to be super public or super private, and so that will hopefully help them and train them to always work on a quality piece. Their self-efficacy. I want students to feel comfortable and good about what they're doing, so I will. The displaying of group projects will happen before an individual projects. It will set the expectation in a more safe and shared situation. Then they will kind of build on top of that. Then they'll present their individual projects to the class, and then in progression, we will hopefully have other teachers and their classes come in and observe, so they have more and more public experience showing their work. So I'm not just throwing them out to the wolves way out into campus. So they feel comfortable and they feel good about what they can do and their potential. And also grades. I really want to experiment with the grades. I know it's a huge factor. So possibly breaking down my grades where they're working on, where the majority of the grade is in the process instead of just the product. So they might stay more on track for the right reasons instead of just the prize at the end. My assessment plan, each week I want to have an exit card that checks in with them and see their feelings toward the current project, so I can really get a nice, steady assessment going on. We can get a quick data read. After creating a piece for a class presentation, I will have them compare and contrast maybe the two pieces so they saw the differences of their private and public piece. So maybe they will see it in the self-reflection. Oh, I might try harder for this, or why do I not try harder when it's public or private? That will give them the opportunity to ask them why. And at the end of each project, they're going to self-evaluate their progress and answer questions about their motivation and stress level, as well as what they learned from the last project that was less public. So they can hopefully see that everything is being scaffolded, and they can compare and contrast. And it's just a good way for me to check in to see their motivation level, and hopefully if the stress levels will be hopefully going down. Thank you.